The German Revolution of 1918 guaranteed that the Weimar Hyperinflation would happen. Why? Because the political ideologues who came to power and founded the Weimar Republic were also the ones calling for the policies that caused it, and were completely clueless on how to stop it. So, in order to fully understand the Weimar Hyperinflation, we need to understand them, who these ideologues were, what they believed, and what they were up to. And in this video, the second in the series on the Weimar Hyperinflation, we're going to do just that, by looking at the real history of the German 1918 revolution and the Spartacist Uprising of 1919. The First World War was devastating to all who took part, but it affected each of the powers in different ways. Germany won the war against Russia in the east, who disintegrated into a brutal civil war which would continue until the 1920s, but Germany then lost the war against the Western powers, who pushed her armies back in the autumn of 1918. As explained in the last episode, by late 1918, the German economy was in ruins, largely thanks to the central planning and inflationary policies of the government. The turnip winter alone is thought to have resulted in 760,000 fatalities. Shortages of food, clothing, soap, and housing led directly to discontent. The German standard of living, it was estimated, had fallen to about half what it had been before the war. It is indicative that the first street demonstration of the revolution in Munich, where 100,000 people took to the streets on November 7th, was set off by an increase of 6 pfennigs in the price of a litre of beer. It's no wonder that the National Socialists didn't destroy their alcohol stocks prior to the Battle of Berlin. Now, while the 7th of November 1918 might have been the first street demonstration, the start of the 1918 revolution began on the 28th of October, when the sailors of the High Seas Fleet mutinied at Kiel, followed by other ports in the following days. This, coupled with the domestic crisis, compelled the Kaiser to abdicate on the 9th of November 1918. He fled to Holland as representatives of the new government called for a ceasefire. Finally, at 11 AM on the 11th of November 1918, the guns fell silent. The Weimar Republic was proclaimed on the 9th of November, and the party that ushered in the Weimar Republic was the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD. And the history of the SPD goes right back to Karl Marx. When Karl Marx wrote the Communist Confession of Faith, which was then renamed the Communist Manifesto, and I'm just pausing there to let that one sink in, it's a cult religion. When Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, he called for totalitarianism. And yes, naysayers, yes he did. Let's just confirm this now. The Communist Manifesto has a 10-point totalitarian program. The first point calls for the nationalisation of all land and property into the state. The second point calls for a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, so more state. The third point abolishes all rights of inheritance, which means that the property gets confiscated by the state. The fourth point steals all property from emigrants and rebels and gives it to the state. And note that he doesn't say he'll take all property, only the property of people he doesn't like, aka the Judeo-bourgeoisie. The fifth calls for the nationalisation of all credit in the hands of the state via a national central bank with a central state fiat currency and state monopoly. So, to all the people telling me in the comments of the last episode that they're not communist central banks, yes, they are. Karl Marx says so right here. Point 6 calls for the nationalisation and central planning of all communication and transport. Point 7 calls for an extension of state-owned factories and production. Point 8 establishes state worker armies like Organisation Tot. Point 9 calls for the central planning of agriculture and industries, as well as control over the populace, and point 10 calls for state schools, which he calls public schools because, as I've said 1,000 times in the past, the public is the state. So Karl Marx was calling for totalitarian state control over everything, totalitarianism, and that was his socialism. Even Karl Marx's critics, including fellow socialists like Mikhail Bakunin, pointed this out. It turns out though that people don't really like the idea of totalitarianism and tyranny, so Karl Marx lied. He claimed that what he was calling for wasn't real totalitarianism. He and Engels said that the totalitarian state would wither away and usher in paradise. He claimed that his utopia would be democratic and libertarian. And people believed him. Yes, some, including Bakunin, remained unconvinced though. You can see quite well that behind all the democratic and socialistic phrases and promises of Marx's program, there is to be found in his state all that constitutes the true despotic and brutal nature of all states. This cult of the state is, in general, the principal characteristic of German socialism. And it wasn't just the socialists who pointed this out, a capitalist did too. The Marxians' love of democratic institutions was a stratagem only, a pious fraud for the deception of the masses. In a socialist community, the individual citizen can have no more freedom than a soldier in the army or an inmate in an orphanage. But, criticism aside, the Marxists formed an international party to promote their ideas. The German branch of this international party eventually became the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, and here is a picture of the 5 early organisers of the party, with Karl Marx sat right in the middle. So, just to make this clear, the SPD was the Marxist Socialist Party in Germany, and as one Marxist historian writes, the German party became the most powerful section of the Second International, which was established in 1889 and grouped together all the socialist parties prior to the First World War. Standing at the head of the International, the party was greatly admired by millions worldwide, including Lenin, who regarded it as a model party. And just to confirm that this guy is a Marxist, since I'll be using this guy's book throughout the series, the author, Sowells, states in the preface to his book that he is a revolutionary and sees no reason to conceal it. He says that his book does not claim any spurious objectivity. It draws from the legacy of Marxism. So to those people who claim that I don't read the correct sources, I am reading sources that Marxists and socialists will agree with. Unobjective ones that are pushing an agenda. The difference is, though, that I don't just take things at their word and think critically and go where the evidence takes me. The point of all this, though, is to say that up until 1917, the SPD contained both the socialists and the communists in the same party. Why? Because until 1917, communism and socialism were usually used as synonyms. A myth has developed that says communists and socialists are completely different from one another, and that there is a difference between communism and socialism. Well, no. Until 1917, they were the exact same thing, and fundamentally, they still are the exact same thing. Socialism is totalitarian. But Karl Marx and others said that it wasn't totalitarian, painting it as democratic and libertarian. So some people became socialists believing in the dictatorship of the proletariat, socialism, while others became socialists because they mistakenly believed that socialism stood for freedom and voting as well as helping the poor. In other words, this latter group believed the Marxist lie. And paradoxically, both of these factions were within the same party. Just to be as intellectually honest as I can be, I'm going to let the Marxist historian offer his explanation as to why this was the case. 2 socialist groups had crystallized in Germany before 1860, one based around Ferdinand Lassalle, which held progressive but confused views, and the other around August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, which was known as the Eisenach Party. The latter were the followers of Marx and Engels. Marx and Engels worked to maintain the revolutionary line within the new party.
They helped combat the influences of Lassalleanism.
So, yes, he doesn't explain why the two opposing ideas of totalitarian socialism and democratic socialism were in the same party, but at least he has confirmed that they were. This ideological schism became more public when German socialist Erdhard Bernstein wrote about it in 1896. Bernstein had been one of the people who buried Engels, and Engels had asked Bernstein to write Volume 4 of Das Kapital, which he didn't in the end, but was asked to do it. So this was a major player in socialist circles.
What Bernstein was suggesting was that it was possible to fight for the well-being of workers, more political and social legislation, better pay and working conditions, without envisioning a new society. The real fault with his argument was that by rejecting teleology, Bernstein's approach would rob socialism of the religious mystique in which Marxism had clothed it.
In a nutshell, Bernstein rejected the idea of a violent revolution and totalitarianism, calling instead for a gradual democratic reform of the system. As you can imagine, this schism tore the socialists in two. They now had two factions within the same movement. This split also explains why some of the socialists, who would soon call themselves communists, wanted a violent revolution and a totalitarian state dictatorship, while others, the democratic socialists, wanted a more gradual reform of the so-called capitalist system with things like workers' rights and national pensions and social housing, whilst also keeping things like voting and liberty. This also explains why there's a bunch of socialists running around crying that socialism isn't state control of the means of production. They're still clinging onto the Marxist lie that socialism is all about freedom and voting and social reform, when in reality it isn't. The history makes it blatantly clear it's nothing other than totalitarianism masquerading as liberty. But again, to be as intellectually honest as I can be, here is Rosa Luxemburg's own words on the matter.
Can we contrapose the social revolution, the transformation of the existing order, our final goal, to social reforms? Certainly not. That's a word salad. In plain English, what she's asking is, can social reforms substitute for the social revolution? She says, no, it can't. The daily struggle for reforms for the amelioration of the conditions of the workers within the framework of the existing social order and for democratic institutions offers to the social democracy the only means of engaging in the proletarian class war and working in the direction of our final goal, the conquest of political power and the suppression of wage labour. Again, in plain English, she's saying that their final goal is totalitarian power and the oppression of the workers. She also says that social reform is the only way for social democracy to reach that goal. Between social reforms and revolution, there exists for the social democracy an indissoluble tie. The struggle for reforms is its means, the social revolution its aim. In plain English, the end goal is the social revolution, and the struggle for social reforms is a way of getting the system to crack and usher in that revolution. She says that the two are interlinked. Interestingly, the Marxist historian Sowells doesn't give the full quote of this in his book, which has 4.5 stars on Amazon. No, according to Marxist.org, he actually missed a large chunk of it out, without giving any indication to the reader that he's changed the quote. The bit he missed out was the whole final goal of socialism being totalitarian power and the suppression of the working man part. Naughty, naughty, Mr. Marxist. You're not distorting history on my watch. Let's make everyone aware that Rosa Luxemburg gave the game away. The final goal of socialism is totalitarian power and the oppression of the serfs. That Orwell quote is looking pretty good about now, wouldn't you say? If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Anyway, until 1917, the ideological split within the Socialist Party was largely confined to the party elite and intellectual circles. The common man knew nothing about it. It was only when Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in late 1917 and implemented a dictatorship of the proletariat that the lie of socialism became exposed to the masses. In Russia, under Lenin's watch, millions would starve to death as his socialist economic policies failed to live up to expectations, and more would be murdered in a brutal civil war, as well as in pogroms implemented by Lenin and his comrades. This had a massive impact on everyone around the world, including the German socialists. The majority Social Democrats viewed the rise of Russian Bolshevism with considerable concern. Lenin had seized power without a mass movement behind him and had turned on the more moderate Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, taking the schism within the socialist camp to a new level. This was why, when the Social Democratic Party of Germany got into power, one of the first things that their leader, Ebert, declared to the German people was that they would not make the same mistake as the communists had in Russia. He said the SPD were there to protect the German people from civil war and famine and to achieve its just demands for self-determination. Ebert, like many other members of the so-called second generation of social democratic leaders in Germany, was a pragmatist. Although he conceived himself as a Marxist, his primary goal in the years prior to the First World War was the gradual improvement of living conditions for the working classes through reforms. Ebert was elected as SPD co-chairman, along with the considerably more radical Hugo Haase, a renowned lawyer, pacifist, and socialist politician from East Prussia. The Marxist historian Sowells says that the reason Ebert and many other socialists within the movement had become soft on the idea of violent revolution was because the German social democratic leaders had grown accustomed to bourgeois society. In effect, they were no longer socialists, but petty bourgeois counter-revolutionaries. Sowell actually claims that there was growing conservatism within the SPD and says that Ebert and the other leaders only wanted to establish a bourgeois democracy. An opinion that I don't agree with at all. Let's take a more rounded view. Due to the general instability of the time, post-war 1918 and directly after the revolution, Ebert decided to work with the old imperial civil service and not introduce democracy into the bureaucracy itself. But he did want to form a democratic socialist government rather than the dictatorship of the proletariat, perhaps knowing that this would reduce the fear prevalent at the time that Bolshevism would come to Germany. And the best part is, at the end of the First World War, the Germans were actually calling for democracy, and it was then that the Marxist lie was exposed. The Ebert government was viewed by the majority of workers as a government for the revolution. For the workers' councils, it was their socialist government appointed by them. Men expected that the Social Democrats would now realise the democratic principles of their programme, and were ready to back this party in its endeavours for political reconstruction. But from the ranks of the Marxians came an answer which nobody outside the small group of professional Marx experts could have foreseen. "We class-conscious proletarians," the Marxists proclaimed, "have nothing to do with your bourgeois concepts of freedom, parliamentarism, and democracy. We do not want democracy, but the dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e. our dictatorship. If you misinterpreted our stand on democracy, that is your mistake. Had you studied the writings of Marx more carefully, you would have been better informed." Unfortunately, most historians don't tell you any of this. Instead, they will say that the split in the socialist camp was due entirely to their stance on the war. So they will say that the pro-war elements of the party became the majority socialists under Ebert, while those who were against the war became the independent socialists under Hugo Haase. The problem is, the party didn't split into two, it split into three. So pro-war, anti-war, and then what?
what was the third faction. In his book, The Coming of the Third Reich, Richard Evans just simply ignores this contradiction in his own narrative.
In 1916, the party split into pro-war and anti-war factions. The majority continued with reservations to support the war and to propagate moderate reforms rather than wholesale revolution. Amongst the minority of independent social democrats, a few, led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, founded the German Communist Party in December 1918. They were eventually joined by the mass of the minority's supporters in the early 1920s.
So the factions were pro-war and anti-war, which is why they split into three. And yes, he does mention the moderate reforms, but doesn't really explain it, and the reason why is because they're skirting around the central issue, which is the fundamental contradiction at the heart of socialist ideology. And the reason why they're ignoring that is because they've bought into the Marxist narrative. In reality, while the initial split into two might have been on the pro-war and anti-war lines, by 1918 that was no longer the case. In fact, as soon as they had seized power, the majority socialists and the independent socialists both agreed that the war had to be ended.
While there was considerable disagreement between the MSPD and the USPD about the future form of government, parliamentary democracy or a council's republic, there was consensus on at least one matter: the war had to be terminated as soon as possible. Bearing in mind that this comes from one of the books that says that the split was on pro-war and anti-war lines. Well, clearly it wasn't, and this idea that the split was primarily because of this falls flat on its face. So it turns out that the three-way split actually occurred because of the democracy versus socialism problem. The three factions were Ebert's majority socialists, who wanted parliamentary democracy and gradual socialist reform, Haser's independent socialists, who wanted a council or Soviet totalitarianism, but also understood that the German people actually wanted parliamentary democracy, and so were hesitant to implement workers' councils and totalitarianism, and the communists, who just wanted the Soviet totalitarianism that Karl Marx had promised, which is why they were known as the Marxists. At this time, the communists were also called the Spartacist League, and were led by Karl Liebknecht, son of Wilhelm Liebknecht, and Rosa Luxemburg. This group denounced the socialist government headed by Ebert's majority socialists, calling them the handmaidens of capitalism. Yes, social democrats weren't real socialists according to the Marxists. Then again, Ebert wasn't fond of the communists either. Ebert fundamentally rejected a Bolshevik-style revolution and hoped for a peaceful transformation of Germany's political system into a parliamentary democracy. In his final conversation with von Baden, he insisted that a communist revolution was the last thing he wanted. "I don't want it. Yes, I hate it like sin." Ebert's words demonstrated just how far the MSPD had moved away from revolutionary orthodox Marxist roots. By 1918, its political objectives had long moved to the evolutionary creation of a parliamentary democracy, the introduction of full equal voting rights for all adult Germans, the improvement of working conditions in the factories, and the expansion of the welfare state. All of these aims were to be achieved through reforms. Even if social and economic injustices persisted, most German workers in 1914 would have agreed that they would benefit more from reforms than from revolution. The split opened up very quickly. Not content with the first revolution, as early as the 18th of November 1918, Luxemburg and Liebknecht demanded a second revolution to topple the first. This was a real threat to the majority socialists because Lenin had seized power with a small group of revolutionaries, and so the now moderate socialists were worried that the same thing would happen in Germany. Worse, despite calling for elections in January 1919, In order for them to do that, the majority socialists had to reject the idea of creating a Soviet or Workers' Council Republic, since democracy was the opposite of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Thus, they alienated the independent socialists, who split from the majority socialists. The totalitarianism versus democracy schism that was central to the problem of socialism was also reflected in the Spartacists' manifesto of 1918. Today, it is not a question of democracy or dictatorship. The question that history has placed on the agenda is bourgeois democracy or socialist democracy. For the dictatorship of the proletariat is democracy in a socialist sense. Incidentally, Wikipedia misses out the bit about the dictatorship being democracy in the socialist sense, because obviously the guys who fund and write Wikipedia don't want you to know that bit. They don't want you to know that totalitarianism is fundamental to socialism, so they've removed that part of the text to deceive you into thinking that it's not. Yes, this is why I don't trust Wikipedia. Anyway, less than 2 months after the guns went silent, on the 5th of January 1919, the Communists and the Independent Socialists took to the streets to take down the majority socialist government in what is now called the Spartacist Uprising, and sometimes the January Uprising. Note, it was both the Communists and the Independent Socialists that did this, not just the Communists on their own. This has led the propagandists on Wikipedia to claim that the Communists were the minority and thus didn't control the events. They argue it was a spontaneous uprising conducted by demonstrators and call Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht the alleged ringleaders of the January Revolt. The Marxist historian Sowells says something similar. Well, these peaceful protesters were both armed and organised, and somehow managed to seize a sizable portion of Berlin, including the newspaper district, where the SPD newspaper just so happened to have been printing articles for a while that were hostile to the Spartacists. This is a photo of some of the Spartacist revolutionaries during the uprising. Look at them. They're not demonstrators, they're armed. They've set up barricades, and some of them have military helmets on. So how on earth can these be classed as peaceful protesters? And here's another photo, this time of Spartacist irregulars. Oh, look at those wonderful peaceful protesters. I mean, if you ignore the bolt-action rifles or the fact that they're clearly organised, since protesters tend to form blobs rather than a line, then yes, these are demonstrators. And Wikipedia is the greatest source in the universe. Praise be. Also, it wasn't spontaneous. The independent socialists, together with the communists and others, all called for the uprising on the 4th of January, the day before. It wasn't as though the people all came out and then the socialists followed. No, the socialists led the assault, and the Spartacists took advantage of the situation to try and seize power. When the independent socialists hesitated, Liebknecht and others typed out their intent to seize power. This declaration wasn't published on the 5th, only on the 14th, after it was discovered by the majority socialists, but the intent was there. This was a revolution. They wanted to seize power. And while Wikipedia said that Luxembourg and Liebknecht weren't the alleged ringleaders, that might have been true at the start, but they clearly became the ringleaders by the end. Now, yes, the violent revolutionaries didn't have mass support, just like Lenin's Bolsheviks didn't either. But that doesn't mean that they weren't at the heart of the action. This was an attempt by the communists and the independent socialists to seize power. The workers not only occupied the offices of the SPD newspaper and the press quarter, but also the Reich printing office, the railway headquarters, food warehouses, and other such buildings. Even the Reichstag was occupied for a brief period. As one SPD member said, if the crowds had had determined, conscious leaders instead of windbags, by noon that day Berlin would have been in their hands. Yeah, it was a bit of a last-minute improvisation, and it was poorly organised, so it had a low chance of success. But it was anything other than a spontaneous demonstration by peaceful demonstrators, as Wikipedia has claimed. As Lenin said previously, a small group of professional revolutionaries is all it would take to seize power. and part of the reason it was badly organised and ill-planned might have something to do with the fact that Rosa Luxemburg herself had never had a job. And despite being pro-socialist and pro-central planning, she was actually opposed to planning. Yes, stupidity at its finest. Part of the reason the revolt supposedly never had a chance of success was because Ebert reacted quickly to what he perceived to be a replay of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, but this time in Germany. The 5th of January uprising was a direct threat against the majority socialists who wanted democracy. So, rather than calling for a violent revolution in the traditional socialist spirit, Ebert asked the workers to protect the government, and in doing so, the majority socialists have come to be seen in leftist parlance as the reactionaries, rather than the progressives of the conflict. They have even been called right-wing. This is in spite of the fact that they were full socialists who just wanted peaceful reform rather than a violent revolution, but that's just how it is to be painted in the leftist narrative, because you're not allowed to know about the fundamental problem at the heart of the socialist movement. But within the context of the time, this so-called reaction makes perfect sense. Lenin's ability to overthrow the provincial government and sideline the much stronger socialist revolutionaries with a handful of determined revolutionaries continued to haunt leading majority social democrats in Germany, notably when Karl Liebknecht and his Spartacist group challenged their government in January 1919. To Ebert and other MSPD politicians, it must have seemed as if Liebknecht was following Lenin's example of establishing a dictatorship of the minority. Even though they didn't want a violent revolution, the majority socialists did threaten to use violence against the independent socialists and the communists, and both sides clashed on the 6th of January as the streets of Berlin echoed with the sounds of gunfire. The Spartacists attacked a military barracks, and then wondered why they failed to convince the military to join the rebellion. And then suddenly, when they had failed, the independent socialists realised that their attempt to seize the government was a mistake, and then they tried to negotiate with the majority socialists to bring the rebellion to an end. This led the majority socialists to conclude that they could peacefully resolve the situation, and the violence lessened as both sides began talks. But this was only a negotiation between the majority and independent socialists. The third group of socialists, the communist or Spartacists, were disgusted by the idea of abandoning the uprising. Liebknecht and Wilhelm Pieck strongly opposed the idea. How could anyone negotiate with a government that they had 24 hours earlier planned to overthrow? The lessons of the last 3 days clearly urge the leading organs of the working class: do not talk, do not discuss things forever, do not negotiate, act. Luxembourg accused the independent socialists of betraying the revolution and compromising with the forces of counter-revolution. That means, in Luxembourg's eyes, that the majority socialists and the independent socialists who had led the first revolution were counter-revolutionaries. Surely, though, it would be the other way around, because Luxembourg was trying to overthrow a revolutionary government. Anyway, this is important because the Spartacist uprising wasn't put down by the other socialists. The socialists in government did next to nothing. They were busy negotiating with the other socialists. It was the nationalist ex-soldiers of the Freikorps that came in and wiped the Spartacists out, using rifles, machine guns, and even artillery against the revolutionaries. These guys were volunteers who were fighting against Bolshevism, not for the majority socialists. Yes, one of the majority socialist leaders asked them to do it, but they weren't fighting for them. And regardless, in the public mind, it was the right wing that came in and smashed the Russian communists, not the socialists. But in the Marxist mind, the majority socialists were deemed to be capitalist counter-revolutionaries. The 1918 revolution was deemed to be not a true revolution, as the communists and Hitler said, and the socialists were accused of working with the nationalist and bourgeois parties and were therefore deemed to be not true socialists. In fact, this interpretation comes from Liebknecht and Luxembourg themselves, who penned this narrative in the final hours before their execution. The horrendous counter-revolutionary mudslide from backward elements of the people and the propertied classes drowned it. Thus, from the Marxist point of view, the Weimar Republic is to be dismissed as a failure of false representative democracy and of capitalism, and not as a failure of socialism or democratic socialism, because, in their mind, the socialists weren't real socialists. Worse, a lot of historians go along with this narrative, and I was even taught this view in college. And it's just not true. The idea of the Social Democrats was that they would create a democratic government and then usher in socialism peacefully by decree. So, as we will see, they attempted to do just that, leading directly to a little-known thing called hyperinflation. They were then forced to backtrack, which resulted in several years of indecision before another bunch of real socialists got into power in 1933. And, by the way, the National Socialists implemented far more socialist policies than Ebert's socialists ever did. So, if the National Socialists are not real socialists, then I guess the Democratic Socialists are even less real socialists, and since they were originally part of the Marxist Socialist Party, that must mean that the Communists are also part of the forces of reaction too, since after all, Lenin didn't implement full socialism either, and neither did Karl Marx. All this is to say that the Weimar Republic was fundamentally democratic socialist at its core. Its leaders were socialist, its policies were socialist, and its currency was socialist. And given the fact that the Bolsheviks in Russia were proud that they had hyperinflated the ruble, was it really a coincidence that a bunch of socialists were in power in Germany when their currency hyperinflated? Yes, the very people who hated money and don't understand it just so happened to be in power as the currency was destroyed. Coincidence? Now, before we move on, one more thing needs to be said about the Spartacist Uprising, because the event also revealed the true nature of what was happening to the German people who had, up until this moment, welcomed democratic socialism. In October and early November 1918, the great majority of the nation was sincerely prepared to back a democratic government. As the Social Democrats were considered a democratic party, as they were the most numerous parliamentary party, there was almost unanimity in the readiness to entrust to them the leading role in forming the future system of popular government. But then came the shock. Outstanding men of the Marxian party rejected democracy and declared themselves for the dictatorship of the proletariat. All that they had professed in 50 years, in short, consisted of lies. All this talk had had but one end in view, to put Rosa Luxemburg, a foreigner, in the place of the Hohenzollerns. The eyes of the Germans had been opened. How could they have let themselves be deluded by the slogans of the Democrats? Democracy, they learned, was evidently a term invented for the deception of fools. In fact, as the Conservatives had always asserted, the advocates of democracy wished to establish the rule of the mob and the dictatorship of demagogues. The Communists had grossly underrated the intellectual capacity of the German nation. They did not realise that it was impossible to deal with the Germans by the same methods that had succeeded in Russia. Within a few weeks, Marxism and Marxian socialism, but not socialism as an economic system, had lost all their former prestige. The idea of democracy itself became hopelessly suspect. From that time on, the term democracy was for many Germans synonymous with fraud. Now, imagine that you're a socialist at this time. Suddenly, your entire belief system has been shattered. You still believe in the idea of socialism, but you now see the socialist parties as the shams that they really are. You also see that the nationalists helped save Germany. So what do? Perhaps a socialist like yourself would create or join a new party, one that combined the ideas of socialism with nationalism. Perhaps you could call it a national socialism. Socialism becomes nationalism, nationalism socialism. They are but one, socialism and nationalism. They are the greatest fighters for their own people. The more fanatically nationalist we are, the more we must take the welfare of the national community to heart. That means the more fanatically socialist we become. Regular viewers of this channel will now hopefully have a bit more insight with regards to Hitler's ideology. He said that the 1918 revolution wasn't a true revolution. He said that democracy had been usurped by the parliamentarians. He said that the Marxists had falsified the term socialism. He said that his socialism was in the middle, while Jewish communism was on the left and Jewish capitalism was on the right. It also explains why he believed communism was a Jewish plot. Luxembourg and some of the other Marxists were Jewish and had supposedly used the bourgeois capitalism of the Weimar Republic to usher in a Marxist revolution, and there's a lot more besides this. I've been reluctant to tell you this in the past because it's not been confirmed, but there is a possibility that Hitler himself may have attempted to join the German Socialist Party prior to the Spartacist Uprising. While this claim cannot be clearly proven, there are indeed reports that in 1918, before the overthrow of the German Soviets, Hitler had unsuccessfully tried to join both the USPD, i.e. the radical split-off from the SPD, and the Communists. If true, it was only after the Spartacist Uprising that Hitler perceived that the Marxist socialist parties had been infiltrated by Jews. And he says something similar in Mein Kampf, although claims his eyes were opened earlier, which is doubtful for a few reasons. And so, at the age of 17, the word Marxism was very little known to me, while I looked on social democracy and socialism as synonymous expressions. It was only as the result of a sudden blow from the rough hand of fate that my eyes were opened to the nature of the unparalleled system for duping the public. Hitherto, my acquaintance with the Social Democratic Party was only that of a mere spectator at some of their mass meetings. I had not the slightest idea of the Social Democratic teaching or the mentality of its partisans. All of a sudden, I was brought face to face with the products of their teaching and what they called their Weltanschauung. In this way, a few months sufficed for me to learn something which under other circumstances might have necessitated decades of study, namely that under the cloak of social virtue and love of one's neighbour, a veritable pestilence was spreading abroad, and that if this pestilence be not stamped out of the world without delay, it may eventually succeed in exterminating the human race. Obviously, I'm not saying that you should agree with Hitler's worldview, but you can certainly understand the reasons why he jumped to those conclusions and why many other people agree with him at the time as well, and some still do. Instead of realising that socialism is a scam, Hitler and others decided to create yet another racial class variant of socialism which they believed would be a real socialism, unlike class socialism. And it wasn't a madman that decided this. Hitler logically came to these false conclusions based on the events that he was seeing in 1918 and 1919. Now, obviously, this didn't happen overnight, and it took time for the majority of the German people to see things the way that Hitler did. But it's funny how, if you stop shilling for one socialist faction or another and actually just tell the story of why the socialist movement split apart, huge portions of the history start to make sense. It's weird that, isn't it? Overall then, the socialists were in charge of the ship that was sailing straight into hyperinflation. It was under their leadership that inflation would be ushered in, and it was their responsibility to fight it. They were socialists. They wanted central banking. They wanted increased spending for social programs and the printing of more and more currency. Is it any wonder that the hyperinflation happened? In the next part, we will see the important election of 1919, the creation of the Weimar Republic's constitution, and the implementation of socialist policies, which only made the economic and inflation crisis worse. We'll also dispel many more myths that have entered the narrative, so that when we cover the hyper part of the inflation,
you'll know exactly why it happened and probably also who was to blame. Thanks for watching, bye for now.